Hello, everyone. It is Tuesday, the 14th of April, 2020. Welcome to Constantine Quarantine News Live. Today, we don't have any interviews, but we've just got a hell of a lot of news, updates, and all sorts of things to run through. Let's start off, of course, by showing you this lovely chat window. If it pops up, there it is. Call, chat. Feel free to do whatever you want to do. You'll be coming through loud and clear, and I'd love to chat. This is going to you live. Now, in terms of getting started, of course, covots.com, covots.com. If you've seen any really interesting business pivots due to the COVID crisis, submit them here. We've got a whole range of industries covered here. We've probably had about 20 or 30 submissions over the last few days, so keep them coming in. There's some really inspiring stories of business growth and ways in which businesses have pivoted in this crisis. Keep them coming in. So, first and foremost, a particularly grim start. Americans spend a grim Easter Sunday at home as COVID-19 deaths near 22,000. Interestingly enough, though, despite the fact that the US has seemingly imposed, let's say, a somewhat haphazard or less than a totalitarian approach, there seems to be a coming off or a flattening of the curve there, both in terms of deaths and new instances of COVID. Interestingly enough, we've had a particularly interesting thing here. Those of us would be familiar of the worldmeters.info website, which is seemingly extremely popular at the moment. If you look closely here, you'll notice that Finland, under total cases, new cases, total deaths, new deaths, Finland recorded a -1 in new deaths. Of course, creating this wonderful meme, guy from Finland, COVID-19, looking particularly scared. So whatever they're doing in Finland, maybe it is the Easter resurrection after all. Something that isn't being resurrected is business confidence. Absolutely horrific headline here in the Australian Financial Review. Business confidence collapses to worst ever. And this is the worst ever since it started in 1989. And of course, we've seen not only a recession, 1998 Asian financial crisis, the 2001 dot-com boom, of course, the 2009 GFC. There have been a few hiccups on the way, and yet this is the worst ever. My view at the moment is that we're doing a good job of flattening the curve, but we now really need to rebuild the economy. Otherwise, we're going to be paying for this for 30 or 40 years, and we're going to see a lot more issues in business, in the economy, and in our own personal finances than we will through any COVID crisis or through any disease. The Economist is running with the idea that the COVID crisis will change the world of commerce. Even though this came out on April 8th, just a few days ago, the idea that this is actually hitting firms a lot harder than we ever could imagine is now coming through loud and clear. And we're seeing that in the Wall Street Journal with their headline here, How Coronavirus Spread Through Corporate America, a wonderful piece of data journalism there, where we're seeing March of 1, 0 companies, March 6, 6, March 13th, 27, March 20, 106, March 27, 189, and April 3, 263 companies. April 10, 295 companies had withdrawn guidance. In other words, withdrawn guidance to the market as to what their profit would be. And in terms of credit drawdowns, a similarly grim story there. As you can see, the rise of credit drawdowns there through this very lovely piece of data journalism and visual journalism there, talking about executive pay cuts, furloughs and layoffs, and the withdrawal line. So again, a really interesting piece of data journalism there by the Wall Street Journal. Also in the Wall Street Journal is this thought of a longer-term prospects of coronavirus response, bigger state, higher taxes. A horrific thought that we were going to be having a much larger role of government in our lives and also much larger taxes. What we're seeing, though, is we're seeing the effects everywhere. Up to 65% of Greek hotels face bankruptcy, new report warns from the Greek reporter. And of course, even in Australia, Virgin Australia enters trading halt as it weighs financial options. And one of those financial options, as is sadly common in poorly run businesses, is run straight to the politicians and ask them for taxpayers' money. The idea of taxpayers subsidising Qantas and Virgin for capital city flights is a disgrace. And no MP in their right mind and no responsible person should consider this. It is a disgrace, the idea that basically a duopoly should be supported with taxpayer money when they're already very comfortably supported by exorbitant fees for their capital city flights. Politico is running another headline, inside the global race to prevent another depression. Again, horrendous that we're talking about these things, but at the moment what we're seeing is that the effects of these shutdowns on business are far worse than potentially what we're going to see in terms of the effects on the disease. But that being said, the Times of London is suggesting that hospitals are urging them to share gowns as coronavirus supplies run critically low. And also the Times of London running another headline here: coronavirus anaesthetics and painkillers run low in intensive care. Horrific thought. And of course, who do we have to thank for that? The Times of Israel running this excellent editorial. Xi Jinping's China did this. And worth reading that excellent Times of Israel editorial, which has had 31,000 shares, and I'd suggest you share it also, because it is a very well, it's a great piece that really goes into the almost criminal behaviour of the Chinese Communist Party, as is their usual method. And the South China Morning Post is running some other news, which is that the quality dangers in China's new coronavirus-induced boom industry. So a lot of Chinese factories are pivoting and creating face masks and all this sort of stuff. And the quality of these Chinese companies is substandard. So not all of these new entrants in China can meet the standards required in their own country and overseas. And we've seen that rejection of Chinese masks already from a variety of countries. So not only is the Chinese Communist Party aiding and abetting the spread of the virus, but also a lot of these new operators out of China can't even make masks that are working properly. So that's horrific news out of China. And even more horrific news: after enduring months of lockdown, Africans in China are being targeted and evicted from apartments, thanks to courts. Again, the Chinese Communist Party have a hell of a lot to answer for, irrespective of what eventually happens. And again, an organisation without a moral and ethical core. And finally, the Times, again of London: pandemic punctures our Chinese dreams. Forget prosperity bringing democracy. Beijing's grip is tightening at home and abroad. And the idea that China is taking advantage of this in order to potentially grow its grip. It says here, the dream is over. For 2 decades, the conventional wisdom has been that China's economic rise comes at no political cost. Indeed, it was argued prosperity would bring democracy. The pandemic has laid bare our mistake. And again, there's going to have to be a lot of soul-searching and thinking in global policy around our dealings with the Chinese Communist Party. Now, closer to home in Melbourne, Australia, Victoria has just decided to extend the state of emergency for 4 weeks for reasons that are relatively unclear. And also what we're seeing in Melbourne is this idea of little local totalitarians getting excited by preventing people from visiting their wives' graves. I mean, that is absolutely disgraceful. And again, a Victorian couple will find $3,300 over a year-old holiday snap that they only just got around to uploading on Facebook. Again, people all over the world using this, or governments all over the world using this as an excuse to just be little pocket totalitarians. Speaking of pocket totalitarianism, Trump insists he has total authority to supersede governors. The last I checked the US Constitution and understood a little bit about federalism, he doesn't necessarily have that power. People who are gaining power, on the other hand, Amazon, acting like an independent nation in its battle against the coronavirus. And thank you again to Quartz for this very good piece talking about how Amazon's really building up its own ability to test its own staff, its capacity to run its own warehouse and ensure that it's got its own COVID-19 testing facilities. So, I mean, they're really taking that the next step to ensure that COVID doesn't go through their workforce and potentially damage their ability to operate. Equally, in Recode, Amazon was already powerful. The coronavirus pandemic cleared the way to dominance. A really great article there talking about how Amazon have really lifted their game, and you're seeing people that may ordinarily not even consider Amazon taking out Amazon Prime memberships just so that they can get delivery of certain things. And how has COVID-19 affected us in terms of consumption? The Economist has got this excellent daily chart. Again, some great data journalism here, how the COVID-19 pandemic is changing American spending habits. A stockpiling surge in early March has given way to penny pinching. So everyone stockpiled, and now everyone's saying, right, how do we cut? And what we've seen here is a huge burst in air travel, in food deliveries, which has now trailed off, in groceries, which has really trailed off, public transport, restaurants, retail, everything had this initial burst of activity and then trailing off. So really, really interesting piece there worth having a look at. And again, The Economist is making, as I've said here, most of its important coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic freely available to readers of The Economist, which is excellent. And now, interestingly, in terms of the way in which people are spending, there's a great article here in CNBC talking about how, stalled by a coronavirus pandemic, American Dream rethinks its future and retail becomes an afterthought. American Dream is a vaunted mega mall, 3 million square foot development in New Jersey. And what they're looking at, or they're saying, it's more like Disneyland if it fit under one roof. And what they're saying here is, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, American Dream was slated to be a mix of 55% entertainment-related tenants and 45% retailers. Now the project will be roughly 70% entertainment and 30% retail. So you can see their view of the future is that retail is going to be less of a mix and less of a part of the economy, which is quite concerning. And staying there in the eastern US, on the eastern seaboard, our Corona celebrity of the day is George Stephanopoulos. George Stephanopoulos is obviously a former campaign advisor to Bill Clinton, policy advisor to Bill Clinton, who then became the host of Good Morning America and has been broadcasting that from home. His wife had coronavirus and now he's got it. So best wishes to George Stephanopoulos for a speedy recovery. And staying with the US news there, New York Post, I love their covers. New York Post is running Bill de Blasio as Billy the COVID, which is a great little post there on New York Post. And I've got to say, we could continue going through their covers, and they tend to have particularly bold and mostly humorous covers there. You know, someone wake up Joe, tell him he's the nominee. There you go. Some particularly bold and jolting headlines there from the New York Post. One of the things, obviously, that's very important is that we look at what a recovery might look like, and this is important, obviously, from an economic perspective. There's a piece here in the Australian Financial Review talking about scenarios for the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis that McKinsey have projected. And what this is saying is, if we look at the axis on the left, scenarios where it's worse, as you can see down the bottom, versus scenario where it's a lot better, rapid and effective control of the virus spread at the top. And then the x-axis there is knock-on effects of economic policy, worse on the left and better on the right. And so what you end up seeing there is where, the top right, A4, is the most optimistic, and the bottom left, B3, is the least optimistic from not only a virus spread perspective, but the economic effect and economic policy response. Interestingly enough, while we're on this, and it's an excellent article in the Australian Financial Review and great analysis by McKinsey. One thing that I will swap over to is the Australian Reserve Bank of Australia has a thing called the Chart Pack, and it comes out every month. and it's an absolute favourite of mine. If you just go to the Reserve Bank of Australia website and put in your email address, every month you get an excellent set of stats, data, and charts covering the global economy and Australia in particular. I wanted to take you through this because not the whole thing, but just a couple of charts here that shows GDP growth of major trading partners to Australia. And I want to focus on this. If we look at this, China activity indicators, manufacturing procurement managers index, which is a measure on the top left there of the procurement managers of China and the people that actually do buy stuff. And any sort of slight changes in that index, in other words, in 2009, during the GFC, it dropped about 40%. What we're seeing now is that only in just the last couple of weeks of March, it's dropped more than 40, well, to less than 40% if you look at it that way. Industrial production, even in the heights of the GFC, was still in positive territory. We've seen a decline here that's closer to beyond 20%, and that's just in March, let alone if the chart were to go into April, I think we'd see it worse. Fixed asset investment during the GFC barely stopped. Real retail sales barely stopped. And what we've seen is that all of those measures from China have fallen off a cliff there. So that's a particularly worrying chart, as is this one. China, gross output of selected products. Electricity generation dropped to levels that we haven't seen since about 2011. Plate glass dropped. Cement dropped to about 2008 levels. Steel products and crude steel drops. I didn't want to really go into that in too much detail, but what I did want to do is show a particularly troubling chart here that talks about Australian debt. What we've got here is housing prices and disposable debt in Australia. You've seen this chart of housing prices going through the roof and disposable debt going through the roof. And what you see also is this idea of the huge amount of household wealth and liabilities that is made up of dwellings in Australia. In other words, people's homes are their main sources of wealth in Australia. But equally, if we look at this, business investment share of nominal GDP in Australia, business investment, which is the driver of wealth rather than houses, has really come off since about 2011 and 12. As GDP has gone up, business investment has really come back down. So it's less than 12%, which is really quite worrying. And the industry share of business investment, as we see, mining is what makes Australia. Mining's come right off as other business services have really stayed the same. However, this is one of the most worrying charts, and something that in a post-COVID era we need to really address in Australia as a matter of priority from all levels of government. Business lending by banks, and this is in billions of dollars, since 2010, small business lending was about $200 billion. In 2020, small business lending is just over $200 billion. So the idea that lending to small businesses, and small businesses of which there's 1.3 million small businesses in Australia that contribute to 80% of all employment, small business lending has barely budged since 2010, which is horrific. And if Australia is to come out of COVID, it needs to, at a complete roots branch government policy level, needs to address the idea that governments need to do something and businesses and banks need to do something about improving the ability for small businesses to borrow money effectively and cheaply so that they can grow the economy. Because without those small businesses, there is no recovery. And that is a particularly concerning chart there. Anyway, I'm going to go back to Safari now, and we'll move on. Speaking of recovery, Andrew Liveris has a plan for Australia, and he's been incorporated into this new group to improve and be part of the recovery of Australia. Andrew Liveris is a former Dow Chemical chief executive and chairman, someone who I heard speak at an event and met only about 4 or 5 months ago. An incredibly impressive man, someone who is who it's gratifying to hear that he's involved in some recovery plans and has a vision for Australia. As many states in the US now are moving to coordinate on reopening plans, and they're looking at saying, well, how do we do this in a way that is as quick as possible? On a totally different note, why is The Last of Us Part 2 delayed when everyone is stuck inside playing video games? The Last of Us, as part of our recovery, mental recovery I'd argue, is one of the greatest games, well, probably the greatest game I've ever played, and the much awaited sequel was coming out on May 24th. That has been delayed, sadly. While you're at home, if you're not going to be gaming, here on Programmable Web is a list of APIs to track coronavirus COVID-19. APIs, application programmer interface, fantastic ways of getting access to data and mashing up and creating your own interesting data sets and visualizations of data. And this on Programmable Web is a list of the huge range of open data sources that exist. Speaking of interesting data, 23andMe, they are a DNA testing firm. They are engaging in a research study to actually see whether or not people of a certain genetic makeup are more or less likely to be getting COVID or rejecting it or recovering from it, more accurately. So that's really interesting there by 23andMe. Apple have basically launched a $50 million advance royalty fund to make sure independent labels can pay artists, and that's in Mac Rumors. So that Apple are doing some really, really good things there, from their COVID tracking apps to this. And what we've got here in Mansion Global, which I believe is part of the Wall Street Journal, tips for becoming the best video version of yourself, which is all well and good. If you're a co-host of CBS This Morning, his apartment looks particularly lovely. But just some advice on how to actually set up the background of your video conferencing to look nice. And I wish I had a lovely looking office like that. Well, that's not bad here. Anyway, let's move on, shall we? And we know it's school holidays very, very soon. The end of school holidays very soon, apparently. What we've seen in NebenLab.org is that the Week Junior have come up with some really wonderful ways to inform children without scaring them about the world we live in. And check that out on Neiman Lab News, or check out the Week Junior. Some really great initiatives. And again, going back to Apple, speaking of great initiatives, Apple have released 30 creative activities for kids, and they're really starting to push that. And we're starting to see a lot of Apple's initiatives more and more, even though this doesn't actually look like it's branded Apple, because it's not. There's some really great initiatives there that you can undertake with kids aged between 4 and 8. And one interesting pivot, and we'll finish on this, is that Dubai Mall has launched Gourmet to Go. Choose from the Dubai Mall's best selection of restaurants with our Gourmet to Go service and enjoy fine dining at home. And I tell you what, I've spent a lot of time in Dubai, and I'd be ordering Shake Shack, Chicken Shack any day of the week, Gourmet to Go. But the food range at Dubai Mall is quite excellent. So for those friends in Dubai, I'd highly recommend you use Gourmet to Go. And I'll leave you with that and any other suggestions for COVID pivots or interesting things you've seen. Go to covots.com, COVOTS. Penso has put together this collection of case studies, businesses, inspiring stories of businesses that are pushing through not only to survive, but hopefully to thrive. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me here on Constantine Quarantine on this lovely 14th of April 2020. Stay safe, stay well, stay at home, and I'd start suggesting stay thinking about ways in which we're going to recover, some ideas and creative ways in business that we might push through and build a post-COVID economy. Cheers.